Hi there. This is the second part of my commentary on the Pageau-Peterson dialogue. In this video, I will be referring to the evolutionary levels of Pirsig's metaphysics of quality, and it's a large component of his metaphysics of quality. So when I say something like the social level, which we will talk about here a fair amount, I mean one of the four evolutionary levels, which are the inorganic, biological, social, and intellectual, that have over the course of many millions of years ratcheted off from each other and exist independently but parallel. Only humans possess the social and intellectual levels. And you can argue that animals have the social level, that they have the primitive social behavior that we see in vestiges of our own social behavior, but the social level has actually ratcheted off from the biological, leveled up, and is its own thing with its own morals and its own will. Animal social behavior is a purely biological one, and ours is supported by this earlier biological social orientation. And indeed, the biological level obviously exists in us and can be more awake in some situations rather than others. But the human social level and the animal social behavior are different things. An obvious way to see this difference is that our social level has evolved, continues to evolve and progress, and theirs does not, just like animal tool use does not progress, but in our human realm, tool use progresses in spades. I mean, look where we are. So animal social behavior has remained the same for millions of years, whereas ours has very much changed over the course of even tens of thousands of years. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes from Pirsig from Lila. This is the first one. As anthropologists know so well, what a mind thinks is as dominated by social patterns as social patterns are dominated by biological patterns, and as biological patterns are dominated by inorganic patterns. This is a confusing statement which seems to say that our social patterns are in fact biological, but this isn't what this really means. I'm kind of trying to prove that evolutionary science can assist us to understand the impact of our biological level on our social patterns, but it can't explain them. And I'm having a rough time with the quote I just read for obvious reasons, so I went to my Pirsig guru, Paul Go, to help me understand the word dominate in this context, and he responded to me. I think Pirsig means preoccupied, fighting against. For example, social moral codes are obsessed with biological rudeness. Think Rigel, think the character in Lila who encapsulates the Victorian morality, which was opposed to by the morality of, let's just say, the 60s, that remained, the main morality up until the tumultuous 60s and 70s. Social moral codes are obsessed with biological rudeness. But in an attempt to overcome them, strictly speaking, to say you are dominated by something inherently suggests a will to be free from that domination. Remember earlier I said that each level has its will. What that will is something that keeps the lower level at bay so that it doesn't overtake the social level. And as you can imagine, much of the social behavior of human beings has been to band together and keep the biological threat at bay. So when Pirsig says the level is dominated by the lower level, that means it's constantly trying to pull the level back to its level, and that the higher level needs to continually fight against that, which is true. So this makes sense. Remember, what's better is toward freedom. If you were looking at it through the God lens, let's say, what's better is towards infinity, towards omnipresence and omniscience. And the ultimate freedom is possessed of this omnipresence, omniscience, is possessed only by God. So what is better, this striving towards what's better, this dynamic quality, you could say is towards theosis. And we get a taste of where to go with that when we perceive quality. Quality comes to us pre-intellectually, kind of like grace. So towards freedom means away from the clutches of the lower level, like a bird overcoming gravity, which is one of the primary forces of the inorganic level. It is our social level that has allowed us to overcome the daily battle with nature that your average animal has to contend with every day, unless they're our house pet or something. And it's the social level that has allowed our intellect to develop, to ratchet off from the social level and become its own thing. But all the levels exist in us simultaneously, and we have to see them both at the same time. You have to see them all at the same time. But to allow the biological to explain away the social is missing the mark. The social is trying to free itself continually from the biological, but it also supports but the biological also supports the social. And sometimes it succeeds in overcoming the social, like, of course, when Lila and Phaedrus, two people who could not be less alike socially and intellectually, end up making love in a very beautiful way, let's say. That is in chapter, I believe, 15. Now, here's another quote from Pirsig to help us understand the levels. What is today conventionally called morality covers only one of these sets of moral codes, the social biological code. In a subject-object metaphysics, this single social biological code is considered to be a minor, subjective, physically non-existent part of the universe. But in the metaphysics of quality, all these sets of morals, plus another dynamic morality, are not only real, they are the whole thing. So that means that the social level is real as all these other levels, biological included, intellectual included. And it's got its own set of morals, which is what you would see in, let's just say, moral prescription, religious moral prescription. So that's a little discussion as a precursor of what we're going into, because I don't want to be making these remarks about this level and that level without at least explaining them to some extent. So there are 6 more clips I'd like to comment on through the Pirsigian lens, and at the end I'd like to talk a little bit more about the church problem.
That Christ is Christ is at least a representation of the ideal man, whatever that is. And we all, interestingly enough, we all seem to have an ideal. And that ideal has us, right? And that's where it's very interesting to consider the role of conscience, because your conscience will call you out on your behavior. And so it seems to function as something that's somewhat independent, or at least as something that you can't fully voluntarily control. Because if you could voluntarily control it, then you just tell the pesky little bastard to go away, or to pat you on the back continually, because there must be few things in life more pleasurable than being a fully committed narcissist, to really believe that everything that you do is right and that you're a good person. And I suppose if you could wave a magic wand and rearrange your mind so that it was constantly telling you that, you'd do it. But you don't seem to be able to do that in relationship to your conscience. It trips you up. And so it tells you when you're not living up to your own ideal. And that means that you have an ideal and you don't even know what the hell it is, but you certainly know when you transgress against it. And I know that there's a strong line of Christian thinking that's identified the conscience with divinity, sometimes with Christ inside, sometimes with the Holy Spirit. And those are very interesting conceptualizations, but you can think of them psychologically, and you can even think about them biologically, to some degree, because we're so social.
I like this clip because it's a good place to talk about the social level, and he mentions the socio-bio connection, which we were just talking about. A lot of problems that are discussed in this corner of the internet have to do with the dismissal of the social level. College-educated, enlightened, rational types do not accept the importance of this level at all, and it is here that they perceive that all those archaic, primitive behaviors and problems and bad things like, fundamentalist religion and exist. So they're likely to attribute social behavior to 2 things. Either it's biological evolutionary foundations or the social constructs. They're likely to mistake the social level for the biological or for the intellectual, because social constructs are essentially enforced ideas. Either way, the independence of the social level gets ignored by educated types, rational types, who additionally oppose people who value the social level still, who they see as, Trump supporting hayseeds, Bible thumpers, etc. So there's a general dismissal of the social level, which is a big mistake. So conscience, like what Jordan Peterson is talking about here, is a strong social pattern. It's what keeps us in an operational social system or hierarchy. It's strongly associated with shame, which is a social emotion. The biological support of shame, using Panksepp's list of the 7 emotions, is panic. Panic of losing attachment to the parent and later to the social network. Panic of being driven out of the hierarchy. So this curbs our behavior to conform to the expectations of the hierarchy. Notice I say at the base is panic, but shame, again, is its own social version of panic. So evolutionarily, there is a basis for the conscience in biology, and part of the reason that conscience is so impossible to dismiss, that it's keeping you connected. But biology can't explain it. Conscience is its own thing. It's a value only at the social level can produce.
One of the constitutive aspects of how reality unfolds and how it appears to us is something like attention, right? It's something, there's a hierarchy of manifestation, because everything that appears to us in the world has an infinite amount of details, right? It has an indefinite amount of ways that you could describe it, angles by which you could analyze it. And so nonetheless, the world appears to us through these hierarchies of meaning, right? I always kind of use the example of a cup or a chair. Like a chair is just a multitude of things. It's a multitude of parts. How is it that we can say that it's one thing? There's a capacity we have to attend, and this capacity we have to attend is something like a co-creation of the world. And so the world actually exists.
Well, a chair is a good example because, you can try to define it objectively, but you end up with beanbags and stumps, and
exactly,
and they don't have anything in common. Well, they're both made of matter, for whatever that's worth. It's pretty trivial level of commonality, but you can sit on them.
Yeah,
and that's what unites them.
There's a mode of being which defines them.
Well, and that's so strange. So many of our object perceptions are projected modes of being. And so even the objective world is ineluctably contaminated with its utility and therefore with morality.
Exactly. And so I think that that's the key. The key is that once you understand that the world manifests itself through attention, and that consciousness has a place to play in actually the way in which the world reveals itself. And so you can try to posit a world outside of that first person perspective, but it's
good
kind
luck.
of diluted.
In this clip is the concept I learned from Jordan Peterson that really blew me away and helped me to understand Pirsig, and really probably made me align with Pirsig, which is meaning over matter, value over substance. So listen how they describe meaning. The chair emerging out of inorganic material, just like the steel of a motorcycle is one substance, but the idea of a motorcycle and the ideas of all these parts emerge from this one substance that is chock full of potential. So Jonathan would say meaning, the meaning of a place to sit comes from heaven, from above, and evokes from the potential of earth or wood or cloth or even a beanbag, a chair. So this meeting of heaven and earth is the meeting of meaning and substance supports meaning. It isn't the whole thing, and that is a real component. That's probably one of the biggest takeaways of the metaphysics of quality. Is it's meaning first, and substance meaning organizes substance. Like in the last commentary, I want to emphasize this notion of attention. What captures attention has quality. And again, Pageau, by using the word constitutive, is pointing to the metaphysical structure of reality. And this is another example of how at the bottom of his metaphysics of human consciousness is an all-encompassing metaphysics that very much parallels Pirsig's. Any real metaphysics is probably going to parallel any metaphysics that we can really use probably is going to parallel Persic, because, and this is my opinion, but I think if you think about it, you might agree, Persic has distilled the nature of reality as well as anyone ever has. So any good metaphysics that we can actually use is going to have a lot in common with the metaphysics of quality.
Which is that attention plays a part in the way the world lays itself out. And that one of them is that the stuff that the world is made of is partly something like attention, something like consciousness, and that has a pattern. And that pattern is the same pattern as stories. It doesn't lay itself out exactly the same, but things exist with a pattern which is similar to stories. They have identities, they have centers, they have margins, they have exceptions. And that's how stories lay themselves out. Like, so a story happens in time, how an identity, let's say, is broken down and then reconstructed. You could say that that's basically the story of every story, how something breaks down and is reconstructed. And so that is a way for us to perceive the identity of things. And so if the world is made of this, then it's actually our world, our secular world, which is a strange aberration on how reality used to exist for every culture in every time from the beginning of time, which is to take that for granted, that something that they didn't call it consciousness, but intelligence and attention are part of how the world lays itself out. And it lays itself out in modes of being. And one of the things that comes out of it is not only that, but like you said, it's not only that you have ideas, but it's that ideas have you, or that it's not only that you engage in modes of being, it's that modes of being have you. And that recognition means that the first level of attention to that looks something like worship.
I love what Jonathan says here, because it's one of the most interesting things about his theory. And it describes the metaphysics in the best way possible. How something breaks down and reconstructed is exactly what the metaphysics of quality describes. A pattern cannot stay a static pattern for all of eternity, even though some of the inorganic patterns certainly look that way to us. But patterns, and as a higher patterns get in the hierarchy, the more they transform, with intellectual patterns transforming almost continually. But the actual breakdown and reconstruction is a parallel between Jonathan's theory and the metaphysics of quality. Persic's pattern orientation describes the pattern orientation of reality. The difference is that Pageau's application is in the form of stories rather than in this very bottom substrate, metaphysical substrate. And he says every culture used to see reality this way. So culture means social. It means we're referring to the social level. So his theory orients around the social level and the metaphysics of this social level. The language of creation are the metaphysics. They have basis in ultimate metaphysics, but they are metaphysics of the social level or of human consciousness. And applying these metaphysics is the basis of religion. What makes Jonathan's view of Christianity the most appealing to me, and likely the people who follow him, to them, is that it follows this metaphysical structure, is that the social metaphysics are a manifestation of ultimate metaphysics that control the universe.
When I talk about this idea of attention, like it manifests itself in the church as well, is that you often say, and I understand it, when you say something like, I act as if God exists, or, I'm afraid to say that God exists. And I think it's because you think, or you tend to think that the moral weight of that is so strong that you would crumble under it, that you would just be crushed under it. And I think
believe that.
And I think that I understand that. But the first thing to act as if God exists, let's say it this way, to act as if God exists, the first thing that it asks of you is not a moral action. The first thing that it asks of you is attention. That's why to act as if God exists is first of all to worship.
The fear of moral implications of the existence of God puts God in the realm of subjects and objects, because this is saying there's a prescribed morality enforced on mankind by God, like the Ten Commandments, let's say. At least our idea of the Ten Commandments. You can, and I'm sure in Jordan's biblical lectures, he's argued the bottom-up, emergent, evolutionary basis of the Ten Commandments. But we're just talking about a bunch of rules that God enforces from outside. I do not believe this is the God that Pageau is referring to. Again, Pageau is referring to the greatest good, that all it takes to connect to this greatest good is attention. And that attention and attending to the greatest good, attending itself is worship. And you attend to the greatest good by making that your all-encompassing focus. And it is in that relationship of the attention and the attended that the dynamic space is where God exists. It is first by attending that you are in grace with God. By being present in that dynamic space of here and now with God, moral actions will follow if your attention is focused on the highest good. This is a joyous relationship, not a fearful one.
We say grace before our meal in the evening, and it's a very serious enterprise, and it always centers around gratitude, for the ridiculous volume of blessings that have been showered down upon us at a volume that's really quite incomprehensible. But despite that, despite that, I'm struggling with this because I don't know how to reconcile myself to the fact of constant pain.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's unjust, which is halfway to being resentful, which is not a good outcome.
No, I agree. And I can't speak, I don't know how to speak to that because I don't have that experience. I don't have that. I don't live with constant pain. And so I don't know what that would do to me. It's probably one of the reasons why it might ruin me, And so, it's very difficult to answer that. I think that the answer has been the cross. That's been the answer. It's maybe easy for me to just say it that way. But that's always been the answer of Christianity, which is that God went to the cross, and that God went down into death and plunged down into death, and there are mysteries hidden. And they're very well hidden, but there are mysteries hidden in that depth.
Gratitude. It's fairly upsetting, even kind of nauseating, how much we take for granted in this prosperous society, COVID aside. Gratitude is sorely missing, and I'm wondering what it would take for us to see this. There's almost nobody in America that doesn't have enough to eat, and this is poor people included. I was a social worker, and there's a lot of problems with people in poverty in this country, but at the same time, we are saved from a lot of the serious issues that people suffer in other countries, although less and less all the time. For example, in this country, to find free food is pretty easy in the USA, and I'm not saying these people should be grateful for their circumstance. I'm just saying that, in general, this is a very prosperous society, and we have so much to be grateful for, and a lot of times we're not. We seem to be trying to find things to be upset about. As a contrast, look at Jordan's latest interview with his illustrator, Juliet, when she talks about trying to get food in Latvia post-Soviet collapse. So that might make you a little bit more grateful. It's heart-wrenching to see Jordan struggle with this problem of how to be grateful when you're in constant pain, and you can really see it in his face and feel it in his voice. Looking at this through the lens of the Peterson levels, this kind of pain indicates that the biological substrate of the social level begins to impede when something is wrong with that substrate. When something's wrong with the substrate, it necessarily has to take precedence, and that's why looking at oneself in terms of parts. And as a therapist, I really like models of personality that are parts oriented. And in this case, you're looking at oneself in terms of the levels. It makes more sense. You can really beat yourself up when you identify your entire self with your social or intellectual level and forget about the biological level, because you feel like all the good stuff in the social and intellectual level should override the biological. And that's not necessarily possible. When the substrate is suffering, it needs to take precedent. So this is a difficult situation to be in constant pain, but it makes sense in the metaphysics of quality that this pain would override some of the good stuff. Doesn't mean you don't have gratitude, but when you look at it through that lens, it kind of, it kind of has to take precedence in a way. So there isn't necessarily a solution to this other than the actual biological problem being fixed on that one level, or something very dynamic occurring, which strengthens the power, the will of the other levels. And someone like Jordan is continually reminding himself in the social and intellectual level how great this is, and this is strengthening those levels to override that impingement of the biological. One other thing that might do it is grace, but grace is so dynamic, it's essentially a mystical experience, and it's very hard to midwife a mystical experience, so we can really only pray for it. Mystics can transcend the physical body, biology, but this means stepping outside all of the levels and remaining in there with the dynamic. It is in this way that they can lay on a bed of nails, but that's a huge sacrifice, and most of us have way too much to live for in the world of static patterns to take that sacrifice and live entirely in the dynamic space.
Utility. There could argue to be some utility in a secular version of the hero myth, that the best way to cope with existence is to tell the truth and to face what you don't know forthrightly, and that will enable you to orient yourself within our finite and bounded existence that ends with our death more properly, more accurately, more advisedly than any other route.
Now here Jordan articulates a very Peircegian approach to coping with existence, which is to remain on track, to hit the mark. Using truth, embodied truth, as a guide is very akin to connecting with quality. And I think that the truth that Jordan talks about will take you there, but it requires feeling it. In the dynamic space of the present moment, you know what is truth. This is one of the major parallels between Jordan's and Peirce's approach. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the church problem. In my last video, I said becoming a member of the church does not appeal to me. I wouldn't say that's true. It actually does appeal to me, but like Paul said in his commentary, Paul Vanderklay, on the first hour of this dialogue, and it's funny because Paul's total commentary is almost twice as long as the actual dialogue. And that indicates the importance of this dialogue in this corner and in the canon, like I was saying. Anyway, Paul said something that was both humorous and poignant. He says, Christ says, "The church is my bride, and she's a mess." I love that. And that is the problem that a lot of us have with the church. I mentioned two patterns that have ruled my view of religion. The first one is my parents' faith in God, and the second is my postmodern art education. My parents won, but they too stopped going to church because she was a mess. They left the U.S. and their relatively formal Episcopal church and came back from being abroad for a few years in the late 60s and early 70s to a church decorated with macrame and with guitar strumming, rather than the organ. And there's a bug in our intellect that says, as Jordan said, if this is an expression of God on earth, then why, for example, do you have this mess? Why do the Catholics address the sex scandal so poorly? It's really hard to overcome a church that's a mess. In addition to that, it's very difficult to put yourself in a social situation where you might not immediately like all these people that are supposed to be your community. You tend to want to make friends with people with your same interests and viewpoint, and the idea of spending a lot of hours in a community of people who may not be the people you would choose as friends is a rough prospect. And this is where Paul and Jonathan give us the answer. that your aim is a community of people all looking upwards. So things like having a bunch of common interests and them being your friends doesn't matter as much. What matters is that you are coming together with this one aim of looking upward. So I think that if you are a purist, you might want, and you want to align with these eternal patterns, maybe purist isn't the word, but maybe if you want to be more in alignment with this metaphysical proposition of Jonathan's, then orthodoxy probably is the way. But orthodoxy is a big commitment. Another alternative is to find a church with a compelling pastor that can motivate you to come together as one and give you, this sensibility that we are joined. And that takes a lot of charisma, and it's a rare thing. And it may be why Paul's channel keeps growing. So maybe I'll go over to our little Episcopal church over here on Sunday now that it's open. I can't guarantee anything, though. I have a friend who's been able to connect with God in one particular Catholic church, and she said, I felt like God was alive here. So that's something we're thinking about. So I hope that makes sense, and I will see you next time with part 3, the final part of my commentary on this wonderful dialogue.